The sky had already slipped into that shade of blue that feels colder than the air. I was standing on the porch, my hands wrapped around a chipped mug, watching the wind bend the last of the autumn grass. The house was quiet, too quiet, the kind of silence that carries its own weight. Somewhere in the distance, a train whistled long and low, dragging the horizon with it. And then I heard it, a soft crunch on the gravel of my driveway. I thought it was the wind or a stray animal. But when I looked up, I saw her, a woman in a worn coat standing at the gate. She didn't speak at first. She just held something small in her hand, letting it catch the fading light. A ring. The sight of it made my chest tighten in a way I hadn't felt in years. Not because of its beauty. Not even because it was mine. But because I had buried it in a place no one should have found. And here she was, holding it as if it had been waiting for me all along. I stepped down the porch slowly, letting the wood groan beneath my boots. Her eyes were steady, though not unkind. "Evening," she said finally, her voice quiet, careful. I nodded. My throat was too tight to speak. "I found this," she said, holding the ring closer. "Caught on a branch," she added, "near an old grave. An unmarked one leaning toward the woods." I felt my stomach drop, a sudden cold spreading through my bones. I wanted to tell her it was worthless. That it was just a piece of metal, a relic of a life gone. But my voice betrayed me, a slight tremor that I couldn't hide. "Thank you," I managed instead, forcing a calm I didn't feel. The ring gleamed between her fingers, and I thought about all the nights I'd imagined it gone forever. She watched me closely as if she could read the hidden tremor beneath my words. The wind stirred the last dry leaves in the yard, dragging them across the cracked sidewalk. Evening was bleeding into night, cold and hesitant, and the quiet between us felt heavy. I wanted her to leave. I wanted to shut the door and pretend the past hadn't come back to find me. But something in her posture, the careful way she stood, the way her gaze didn't waver, kept me rooted to the spot. I didn't know whose it was," she said finally, softer, almost to herself. I swallowed, my mouth dry. It doesn't matter," I whispered, though the lie tasted bitter in my own mouth. She tilted her head slightly, not looking away. "You buried it," she said. "Near that grave. Why?" The question landed like frost. Not loud, not demanding. Just a simple, quiet question. And yet it filled the space between us like smoke. I wanted to tell her to leave. To close the distance before my memories spilled over. But I couldn't. I didn't move. She shifted her weight, letting her coat sway in the wind. I noticed the dirt on the hem, the way the soles of her boots were scuffed from a long walk. She hadn't driven far, or maybe she had. I couldn't tell. All I knew was that she had found something I thought was lost. And somehow in that instant, it felt as though she could see all the places I'd tried to hide. I thought about Daniel, about the last winter we shared before he disappeared. The arguments, the long nights he never returned. The note he left on the kitchen counter, just the word time written in his familiar script. I had buried this ring in anger. In grief. In hope that hiding it would make the absence easier. And now here it was again, between someone else's fingers, waiting for a story I wasn't ready to tell. Her eyes softened slightly. "You don't have to answer," she said. "But why was it there?" The wind lifted a chill from the fields, swirling around the edges of her coat. She didn't look impatient. She didn't look demanding. She looked like someone who had stumbled upon something too heavy to carry alone. I stepped back, my hand brushing the edge of the door. The porch light threw a weak circle around my boots. I wanted to slam the door. I wanted the night to swallow us both. But I didn't. I just closed it slowly, leaving her in the shadow of the yard. And even though she was gone, her question lingered in the hall, in the cold air, in the rhythm of my heartbeat. Louder than the knocking ever was. I leaned against the door, pressing my forehead to the wood. The ring felt impossibly heavy in my mind, though it rested with the woman somewhere outside. I could hear the wind in the trees, the low whistle of the distant train, and the quiet of the house, still alive with its own memory. It had been 7 years since Daniel vanished. 7 years of silence. 7 years of carefully burying pieces of him I thought I could live without. And yet here I was, reminded that nothing stays buried forever. I poured a cup of tea I didn't drink, and the steam curled slowly against the dim light. I thought about Amara, though I didn't know her name yet, about the way she had held the ring, about the soft weight of her gaze. There was no malice, no demand. Just a presence. A quiet reminder that the past doesn't ask permission. And that some questions are louder than any knock. I sat in the living room, the floorboards creaking under my weight, listening to the wind sweep across the porch. Outside, the night deepened, cold and unbroken. And I knew, with a certainty I hadn't felt in years, that the ring, the grave, and the woman who held it had already started to pull me back into a story I thought I had closed. I didn't move from that chair for a long time. I didn't speak. I only let the silence stretch, thick and unyielding, while Mara's question spun in my mind. Why was it there? And somehow I knew that closing the door didn't end the story. It only delayed the moment when I would have to face the answer. The sky was still dark when I stepped onto the frost-bitten road. The air bit at my cheeks, sharp and clean, leaving a taste of iron and winter. I didn't bother lighting a lantern. The thin crescent of moon was enough to guide my steps. Each crunch of my boots on gravel echoed across the empty fields. I passed the old fence that separated my yard from the cemetery, its posts leaning like tired sentinels. The wind carried whispers through the bare trees, dragging dry leaves along the dirt path. I wondered if the night was listening, if it remembered the stories I had tried to forget. Mara's words from the other evening played over and over in my mind. Found it, near a grave. I couldn't shake the image of her holding my ring, small and bright against her palm. And now I was here in the cold before sunrise, chasing a shadow of a memory I had tried to lock away. I didn't know what I expected to find. An empty patch of earth, a ghost, or perhaps the quiet weight of the past. All I knew was that the ground had already started to speak to me in silence. I walked past graves with names worn thin by rain and time. Some were cracked, leaning like they couldn't hold themselves upright anymore. Then I saw it. The grave she described. Or at least the one my mind recognized from the story Mara told. The earth was disturbed, softened by winter moisture. And the cross leaned slightly to one side, bare of any inscription. No name. No date. Just a hollow in the world where someone had been laid to rest. I knelt, my gloves brushing the soil, feeling its cold dampness seep through the fabric. The impression of boots was still visible, pressed deep into the dirt. My breath came out in thin clouds, curling and fading into the air. Somebody had been here recently. Somebody had found the place I thought was secret. I pressed my fingers into the uneven ground, tracing the slight indentations left behind. Each mark was a question I didn't want to ask. I remembered the night I hid the ring, the storm that had erased my own footprints, leaving nothing but the sound of the wind and my heartbeat. And now someone else had walked the same path. I rose slowly, brushing frost off my sleeves, and let my gaze wander across the cemetery. The trees were skeletal, their branches scratching the sky. I could see the old chapel in the distance, its windows dark, its bell silent. I could hear nothing but the soft sigh of the wind, carrying the scent of wet earth and pine. My chest ached with a quiet realization. The past wasn't buried as deeply as I had thought. It had waited for someone to find the ring, to uncover what I had left behind. I crouched again, this time staring at the small depression where the ring had apparently been found. It felt impossibly fragile, like the place could crumble if I touched it too hard. I remembered the night I had chosen this spot, how I had trembled as I pressed the ring into the frozen ground. It was my act of letting go. My attempt to pretend the absence of Daniel didn't matter anymore. And yet, somehow my secret had a way of surviving. Someone had come after it. Someone had followed the whispers the earth carried. The thought made my stomach knot. Who had walked here? Why did they care about something I had hidden so carefully? Was it Mara? Or someone else entirely? The forest beyond the grave seemed to lean closer, as if listening. Branches swayed with a soft creak, casting thin, long shadows across the frost. I shivered, though I wasn't sure if it was the cold or the weight of the question pressing down on me. I traced the edges of the hollow with my gloved fingers, feeling the soil crumble beneath me. It was too fresh for a grave that old, too defined for winter's decay. Somebody had tended it, though I couldn't see any flowers or markers. I wondered how long they had stood here before I arrived, breathing the same air, following the same path. And I wondered what they had thought when they found my ring. I pressed my palms against my face, letting the cold bite through the fabric of my gloves. I remembered Daniel, the way he disappeared one winter evening, leaving only silence behind. I remembered the letter he never sent, the note I found too late, the look in his eyes when he said he needed time. And I remembered the ring, buried in an act of anger, grief and fragile hope. It had been mine, hidden in a place no one should have discovered. The wind moved again, rustling dry leaves and carrying them across the disturbed ground. I stood slowly, letting my hands hang by my sides. The sky was beginning to lighten in the east, a pale brush of pink and gray over the horizon. I could feel the frost creeping into my boots, cold and unrelenting, but I didn't care. I took a step back from the grave, glancing once more at the small hollow in the earth. Who had been here? And why had they found what I thought I had buried forever? I turned toward the road, my boots crunching against the frost-bitten gravel. The wind followed me, carrying the whisper of old leaves and older secrets. For a moment I imagined the figure who had left the ring, standing in the shadows of the trees, watching. And I wondered if they knew what their discovery would awaken in me. As I walked back toward the house, the grave disappeared behind the bend in the road. The cross leaned silently, unmarked, and the imprint of boots lingered like a question unanswered. I didn't know if I was afraid of the grave or of what it meant for the ring, for Daniel, for the years I thought I had survived. And somewhere in that quiet winter morning I understood. The past doesn't stay buried, not when someone else knows where to dig. The kitchen was quiet, except for the soft hum of the refrigerator and the occasional creak of the floorboards beneath my feet. I sat at the small wooden table, the single lamp above me casting a pool of yellow light that barely reached the corners of the room. On the table lay the ring, my ring, the one Daniel had dropped in the barn that winter night, scratched and worn from years of careless use. I reached for it, hesitating. My fingers hovered above the cold metal, and for a moment I thought I might pull it away, hide it again. But something held me there, staring at it, tracing the tiny imperfections that told a story only I knew. I remembered the last winter we shared. The arguments that stretched late into the night, our words cutting sharper than the frost that settled on the windowsill. The long absences, the nights I waited by the door for him to return, listening for the sound of the train or the crunch of his boots on the porch. The note he left on the kitchen counter with a single word, time. Time, he said, as if it could erase the days he had already taken from me. I had buried this ring after that, after the sheriff declared him missing with no leads. It was my way of letting go. My way of pretending the absence didn't matter anymore. The metal felt heavier now, though I hadn't picked it up yet. I thought of the night I had buried it, pressed it into the frozen ground behind the barn where no one would ever find it. I remembered the snow, how it had swallowed my footprints, how the wind had whispered through the trees like it knew my secret. I had imagined the ring lying there, waiting for no one, lost to time and memory. And now it was here in my kitchen, and it felt impossibly small and impossibly loud at the same time. I fit the ring over my finger, letting it slide until it rested at the base. It no longer felt like mine. It didn't have the same weight, the same warmth, the same ownership I had imagined when I hid it. It was a relic of a life I thought I had buried alongside it. And yet it had returned, dragging the past in with it. I touched it lightly, as if even that small motion might awaken memories better left sleeping. I thought about the sheriff, about the night he told me there were no leads, no witnesses, no hope of finding Daniel. I remembered the way his eyes lingered on me, not with pity, but with the kind of quiet understanding that carries more weight than words ever could. He had known that burying the ring wouldn't bury the memory. And I had believed him for a time as I rebuilt my life out of silence, routine, and small, careful truths. The lamp above me flickered, casting shadows that stretched across the walls like fingers reaching for something long gone. I thought of Mara, the woman who had returned my ring, who had asked why it had been found near a grave no one remembered. Her question lingered like smoke in the room. Why was it there? I wanted to dismiss it, to say it was nothing, worthless, a piece of metal that had no claim over me anymore. But I couldn't. The question had roots in my chest, twisting around my ribs with quiet insistence. I ran my fingers over the scratches Daniel had left behind, the telltale marks where he had fumbled or dropped it in haste. It was intimate in a way no one else could understand, a map of a man I had loved and lost. And suddenly I wanted to know everything. Where had it gone? Who had found it before Mara? I pressed my palm against the table, feeling its grain beneath my hand, and wondered how many people had unknowingly brushed against the traces of my secret life. The clock ticked softly, its hands moving with deliberate patience. I realized I hadn't thought of him in months, not truly, not in the quiet of the night where the shadows linger long and questions fester. And yet here was the ring bringing him back in a way that made my chest ache and my hands tremble. I leaned back in my chair, staring at the ceiling, letting my mind drift to the barn, to the snow, to the night I had tried to hide him in memory as much as in metal. The silence was thick, the only sound my own slow breathing, echoing like a confession I hadn't yet spoken aloud. I thought of the people who walk paths we can't see, who follow footsteps we don't leave, who find what we think is lost forever. I imagined Mara in the woods, holding the ring, the weight of its story pressing against her hands. And I realized then that the past isn't a thing you can bury and forget. It waits. It watches. It finds a way back to you, whether through a person, an object, or the quiet insistence of memory. I pressed the ring to my lips, lightly, almost reverently. It was small, fragile, and yet it carried years of absence, grief, love, and loss. I didn't know what it meant that it had returned, or what I was supposed to do with the question it carried. I only knew that sitting there, in the dim light, the weight of it pressed against my finger and my chest both, I could no longer pretend the past was gone. I rose slowly, my chair creaking beneath me. I looked at the window, toward the woods where the grave waited, dark and patient. The snow had long since melted there, leaving mud and footprints that weren't mine. And I realized that someone had been there, walking the same path I once walked alone. I didn't know who. I didn't know why. But I knew that my life, my silence, and the secrets I thought were buried had just begun to unravel. The ring caught the light from the lamp one last time before I set it back on the table. It glinted small and quiet as if nothing had happened. But I knew better. And I knew, too, that the moment had come when I could no longer ignore the story that had returned to find me. The wind had picked up by the time I stepped outside. It carried the scent of dry grass and winter frost, brushing my hair against my cheeks and tugging at the edges of my coat. I didn't hear her approach at first. Then there was a soft crunch on the gravel, deliberate, steady, and I knew before I saw her who it was. More. She stood at the gate as if she had always belonged there, holding herself with quiet certainty. Her coat was streaked with mud from the dirt road. The late afternoon light caught the edges of her hair, casting it in copper tones that made the world seem warmer, though the air was still sharp. She didn't smile, not really. But there was a calmness about her that unsettled me in a way I couldn't name. "I thought you might want to know something," she said, her voice low, careful. She held out her hand. I knew what she would show me before she said it. The ring. I looked away, but my chest tightened anyway. It gleamed in the fading light, catching the shadows of her fingers. "Flowers," she added. "Someone's been leaving them at the grave. Wilted but fresh." I blinked. My throat went dry. I wanted to say nothing, to let her stand there and leave me alone. But the lie that rose in my mouth felt bitter and hollow. It wasn't me," I murmured. Her gaze didn't shift, didn't soften. She watched as if she could see the story behind my eyes, the truths I hadn't spoken aloud. The wind moved through the dry grass at the edge of the field, dragging faint whispers across the ground. Somewhere a branch snapped, a bird startled. I felt the weight of silence pressing against my chest. Her presence was steady, patient, and it made me remember all the nights I had stood alone in that same wind, waiting for Daniel's return. I hadn't realized how long it had been since anyone had looked at me like that, like they knew there was more than I wanted to say. She took a step closer. "Was he someone you lost?" The words were soft, but they struck me like a bell. I closed my eyes, feeling my hands curl into fists at my sides. "Daniel." The name hovered on my tongue, trembling like the last leaf on a tree before it falls. I didn't answer. I couldn't. Not yet. She didn't press. Instead, she watched the way my shoulders tightened, the way my eyes darted to the ground and then back to her. I felt like a secret being weighed, measured, and found wanting. The winter sun dipped lower, the shadows stretching long across the yard. Somewhere, a crow cawed, sharp and sudden, and I jumped, though I didn't know why. "I just thought you should know," she said again. And in the quiet that followed, I realized she wasn't offering judgment or answers. She was offering observation. Witness. A reminder that the past doesn't disappear no matter how carefully you bury it. I didn't trust myself to speak, so I nodded instead, letting my fingers brush the edge of the gate. Her boots scuffed the gravel softly as she stepped back, waiting, patient, quiet. I thought about the grave. About the footsteps in the mud. The flowers laid carefully, wilted but determined to be seen. About the ring she had returned, the weight of its story pressing against my chest. She had arrived like a whisper, unassuming, yet carrying everything I had tried to forget. And now she was gone. Not entirely, though. I could feel her presence lingering, like a shadow in the corners of the yard, in the sway of the trees, in the cold brushing of the wind. I closed the door slowly, pressing my palm against its worn wood. Her words echoed in my mind. Was he someone you lost? The question had roots, deep and quiet, curling around my ribs and squeezing. I sank into the kitchen chair, the ring still untouched on the table, and let my hands cover my face. I thought of the nights I had walked past the grave in silence, tracing the snow or frost that had erased my footprints. I thought of Mara standing there in the cold, holding my story as lightly as she could. I thought of Daniel, the way he had vanished into a winter night, leaving nothing but absence behind. And I realized with a sudden weight that pressed into my chest, that I couldn't ignore her presence. I couldn't ignore the way she had returned something lost, or the questions she had brought with her. The wind rattled the window panes. The house felt alive, listening, holding its breath along with me. I could hear the soft ticking of the clock, the low hum of the refrigerator, the faint creak of the floorboards. And I understood that Mara's return wasn't just about the ring. It was about the past waiting, watching, insisting on being seen. I let the silence stretch, letting the shadows lengthen across the room. I pressed my palms against the table again, feeling its grain under my fingers. The ring caught the lamplight, small and quiet, but it carried all the noise of memory. And I knew, in a way I hadn't before, that the story Mara had brought with her was far from over. The light outside dimmed further, and the wind carried the scent of pine and earth from the woods. I leaned back, staring at the ring at the door at the empty yard beyond. Her question hovered in the air, soft but insistent. Was he someone you lost? I didn't answer. Not yet. But I knew I would have to. And somehow, in that quiet moment, I understood that the past had already begun to rise. It was reaching for me, slowly, quietly, like frost creeping across a window pane. And there was nothing I could do to stop it. I should have known the moment I stepped outside that something was off. The barn door stood ajar, swaying gently with the cold evening wind. I was certain I had closed it hours ago, the metal latch clicking against the wood with the finality I remembered. But now it moved, slow and deliberate, letting the chill seep into the barn and beyond. The smell of hay was stronger than usual, mingling with the sharp scent of earth and old wood. I hesitated at the threshold, my hand hovering over the latch, my breath catching in my chest. The moonlight poured through the gaps in the wooden slats, casting long, thin stripes across the dust-laden floor. Every speck of floating mote seemed alive, moving lazily in the pale beams. I stepped inside, boots soft on the uneven boards, listening to the creak of the barn as if it remembered every moment it had ever witnessed. Footsteps, mine from years past, seemed to echo against the walls, mingling with something unfamiliar, something that had arrived after me. I followed the light, letting it guide me past the stalls where Daniel once tended the horses. The smell of damp hay and rotting straw clung to my coat, sticky and heavy. Somewhere deep in the barn, shadows pooled like water, waiting. I saw footprints in the dust. New ones, layered over the old ones I recognized, leading toward the back wall where Daniel had stored his tools. I crouched to inspect them. The prints were large, deliberate, and certainly not mine. My pulse quickened. Nothing was missing. Not a hammer, not a nail, not even the old wrench Daniel had used for years. And yet the presence was unmistakable. A weight in the air, a quiet acknowledgement that someone had been here, walking the same boards I had tread for years. I could feel it in the chill against my skin, the way the shadows seemed to shift when I paused, the way the dust settled back into place as if holding its breath. I remembered Daniel, his hands rough from work, the way he moved in this space as if it belonged to him alone. The night he vanished came rushing back, the wind slicing through the barn cracks, the distant whistle of the train, the sense of absence that settled like a fog. I pressed my fingers to the wood of the stall nearest the back wall, feeling the grooves and scratches he had left behind. And I wondered, was someone searching for what I had hidden? Or for what Daniel had left behind? The silence became a presence of its own. I could hear the old hinges groan softly as if speaking in a language I had forgotten. The air was thick with dust and memory, carrying the faint odor of the straw I had swept countless times. Somewhere in the dark corner of the barn, the shadows seemed to gather, not threatening, not accusing, but insistent. I sensed eyes watching me, though there was no one there. I moved slowly, tracing the lines of the barn with my gaze, remembering how Daniel had laughed in this space, how the hammer rang against the wood, how the scent of sawdust and pine lingered long after his hands were gone. And I realized that memory, like dust, doesn't settle quietly. It clings. It waits. And sometimes, it walks alongside you, invisible but undeniably present. I knelt by the footprints again, letting the cold dust sift through my fingers. They were new, crisp against the worn boards, yet deliberate, familiar in a way I couldn't place. I traced the trail toward the wall where Daniel kept the chest with his tools. Nothing had been disturbed. But the message was clear. Someone had been here, someone who knew what they were looking for. And perhaps someone who had known him. The moonlight shifted, slanting through the cracks and illuminating the back wall. I ran my fingers along the boards where Daniel had once hung his tools. Nothing moved. Nothing was missing. But the air felt charged, like it had been holding its breath for years, waiting for me to notice. The chill pressed deeper into my chest, the way winter always does, and I realized that I could no longer pretend the past was quiet, that the barn was merely a space of work and memory. It was alive with the things we bury, with the echoes of those we lose. I rose slowly, boots creaking on the floor, and glanced toward the door. The barn was still but not empty. The shadows lingered, stretching thin fingers across the floorboards. I felt it again. The weight, the presence, the silent insistence that what is buried does not always stay hidden. I pressed my palm to my chest, feeling the rhythm of my pulse against the quiet. And I understood. The barn held stories I had never told, and someone had come here to listen. Outside, the wind rustled the dry grass, carrying with it the faint scent of earth and the promise of more snow to come. I could feel the past pressing in, cold and undeniable, brushing against my back, curling around my ankles. The barn door creaked slightly, as if affirming the truth I had already known. I stepped out, leaving the shadows behind, but feeling them follow in a way I could not shake. I closed the door behind me, letting the latch click into place, but the chill remained. I leaned against the wood, listening to the night, letting the wind sweep through the yard. I thought about Daniel, about the nights we had spent here, the secrets we had buried alongside our routines. And I realized, as the moonlight faded and the stars blinked overhead, that someone had found a path into the silence I had built around my life. The barn was no longer just a place of work. It had become a threshold, a space where the past and present met, where memory and presence collided. And I knew, deep in my chest, that what had walked in that night would not leave quietly. Not until I faced it. I turned toward the house, the cold pressing against my shoulders, the sound of my boots on the gravel, a quiet heartbeat in the night. And somewhere behind me, the barn waited, silent but alive, keeping its secrets, holding its truth, and whispering that the story was far from over. The office smelled of old wood and lingering coffee, faintly sweet, faintly bitter. I stepped inside, boots muted on the worn linoleum floor, and paused at the doorway. Sheriff Nolan was there, hunched over a stack of papers, his glasses slipping down the bridge of his nose. Time had changed him. Lines etched deeper into his face, shoulders heavier, the quiet exhaustion of someone who had seen too much. He looked up slowly, recognition flickering across his eyes, a spark of surprise I hadn't expected after all these years. "Lena," he said, voice low, almost cautious. His words carried a weight I couldn't place. I nodded, stepping fully inside, letting the door click softly behind me. The room was still, filled with muted light filtering through blinds, dust motes drifting lazily in its beams. Everything smelled of paper and ink, of memory and things forgotten. I cleared my throat, trying to steady the tremor in my voice. "I need to ask you about a grave," I said, keeping my tone even, careful. His hands paused on the paperwork, lingering as if on cue, and his eyes darkened slightly. The silence stretched, thick and uncomfortable, and I realized he had been waiting. For me, for this, for something unspoken. "The unmarked one," I continued. "Near the cemetery road." He didn't answer at first, his gaze drifting to the window where the winter trees leaned into the wind. Finally, after what felt like hours, he spoke. "It was dug decades ago," he said, voice low, almost ashamed. "A man was found, no ID, no claim. We didn't know who he was, so we left it blank. That's all I remember." I swallowed hard, feeling the chill of winter press into my chest through the thin fabric of my coat. "Decades ago?" I asked, though I already knew the answer would be insufficient. He nodded, eyes on the faded map of the county pinned to the wall. No one claimed him. Not then, not since. But sometimes someone leaves flowers. Don't know who. No one ever says a word. His hesitation spoke louder than the words themselves. I could feel it. The weight of secrets he carried quietly, and the care with which he withheld pieces of the truth. The sheriff had forgotten more than I had expected, or perhaps remembered selectively. His silence was heavier than any confession, pressing against my chest, insisting on acknowledgement. I thought of the footprints in the mud, the ring returned by Amara, the presence I had felt in the barn, and the soft, persistent questions left behind by shadows and winter wind. Someone had been here. Someone had tended the grave. And Sheriff Nolan had known or suspected or perhaps forgotten entirely, but that didn't erase the truth. The air between us was thick with unspoken words, with the quiet tension of knowledge partially shared. Do you know who returns to the grave? I asked finally, voice low, tentative. He shook his head slowly, exhaling as if the act of breathing out the truth might ease the weight on him. I can't say. Never have. And if I did, it wouldn't make the story any clearer. He leaned back in his chair, fingers drumming softly on the wood, eyes fixed on some distant point I could not see. I thought about the years I had spent rebuilding my life, living in silence, in routine, in careful control of the small truths I allowed myself. And now here was the sheriff, a man who had handled Daniel's disappearance, who had overlooked the connections that mattered, whose memory was clouded by time or choice. He had forgotten the details, perhaps intentionally, perhaps by accident. But the past had not forgotten me. The past had not forgotten the grave. I pressed my hands against the cold edge of his desk, feeling the grain of the wood beneath my palms. I need to know, I whispered. He exhaled, longer this time, heavy with resignation. Lena, some things, they're meant to stay in the dark, he said. But I knew better. I had felt it, seen it, and touched it. The invisible threads pulling the past into the present. The footsteps in the mud, the returned ring, the flowers left quietly in the night. I left his office without another word, the winter wind slapping against my coat as I stepped onto the gravel outside. The trees leaned into me, bare and patient, carrying the scent of earth and something older, unspoken. I realized the sheriff's forgetting didn't protect me. It didn't protect the grave. It didn't protect the questions or the footsteps, or the truths that Amara had brought with her. The road back to the house felt longer than usual. Each step crunched against the frost, echoing in the quiet night, a reminder that memory is heavier than snow. I thought about Amara, about Daniel, about the man in the unmarked grave, and about the quiet weight of the years I had spent pretending none of it mattered. The sheriff had forgotten, yes, but someone else had not. And the winter night whispered in agreement, carrying the promise that the story was far from over. By the time I reached the house, the moon had dipped lower, leaving the yard in a soft silver half-light. I stood for a long moment, glancing at the shadows of the barn, the trees, the field beyond. The past was no longer contained in memory. It had been stirred, awakened, and it demanded acknowledgement. I could feel it, the weight of the grave, the footsteps in the mud, the presence that had been waiting patiently all along. I closed the door behind me, leaning against the wood, letting the warmth of the house seep into my frozen limbs. And in that quiet, I realized that the sheriff's forgetting was inconsequential. What mattered was what I remembered, what I would do next. Because the past doesn't need witnesses to matter. It only needs someone willing to face it. The floorboards groaned under my weight, though the sound was softened by years of careful wear. I knelt by the spot Daniel had once repaired, my fingers tracing the seams where the wood met the frame. Dust rose in gentle clouds around me, motes drifting lazily in the pale winter light streaming through the window. For a long moment I just listened to the quiet, the distant whistle of the train, the hum of the refrigerator, the low wind stirring the bare branches outside. And then my fingers caught on something uneven. I pried at the old wood carefully, careful not to splinter it, careful not to disturb what had lain hidden for so long. The boards shifted with a reluctant creak, revealing a small envelope tucked beneath, yellowed and brittle with age. I lifted it gently, feeling the weight of it, wondering how I had never seen it before. The envelope carried the faint scent of paper aged by time, a smell that made my chest tighten, made my pulse catch in a way I hadn't expected. Inside was a letter, folded neatly, Daniel's handwriting scrawled across the page in long, familiar loops. I could recognize the small quirks in the letters. The way he crossed his T's, the way the ink smudged slightly at the corners. I held it in my hands, trembling as if the paper itself could transmit the warmth, the fear, the guilt he had carried all these years. I didn't know where to begin, so I read the first line aloud, softly, letting the words fall into the quiet room. "I'm sorry for what I couldn't carry any longer." My breath stuttered, caught between the memory of him and the weight of the letter. The words painted a picture I had never known. A man buried near the cemetery woods who had come to Daniel for help. Fear had driven him from home, fear that had followed Daniel into silence, fear that had kept him away from me. I traced the lines with my finger as I read, feeling each word like a pulse, a heartbeat from the past reaching out through time. Daniel wrote about guilt, about promises he could not keep, about a weight so heavy he had to leave it behind. And then the final line. "If you ever find this, know that I tried to make it right." My hands shook, the paper slipping slightly, and I pressed it to my chest as if holding it closer could make sense of the absence, of the mystery, of the years of silence. Tears stung the corners of my eyes, though I didn't let them fall. I couldn't. The winter light shifted across the room, painting the dust motes gold for a brief moment, then fading back into pale gray. I thought of the unmarked grave, of Mara returning my ring, of the footprints in the snow. I thought of the barn and the cold and the way the past had been following me quietly, insistently for years. Daniel's words filled the empty spaces I had tried to ignore, answered questions I hadn't dared to ask, and left new ones in their wake. I pressed the letter against my lips, whispering his name softly, almost reverently. "Daniel." I could feel him in the room, though he was gone, though the wind outside carried only silence. The letter was a bridge, a fragile, trembling bridge between the life I had built in absence and the truths I had buried too deep. I ran my fingers along the paper, feeling the slight ridges of the ink beneath my touch, imagining the hands that had written these words, the fear and care pressed into every stroke. I thought about Mara again, about her eyes, calm and patient as if she knew what I could not yet see for myself. And I understood that this letter was more than apology. It was a key. It was a message from someone trapped by circumstance, trying quietly to make amends in ways that didn't require my presence. It was proof that the past wasn't finished, that it had been waiting for me to listen. I leaned back against the wall, holding the letter close, letting the dust settle around me. The house was quiet but not empty. It was filled with echoes, the creak of the floorboards, the sigh of the wind, the memory of footsteps and voices long gone. I pressed my palm to the envelope again, feeling the faint warmth of a man who had loved and failed and feared beyond words. And I realized that the story wasn't just his. It was mine too, carried in the spaces between the words, in the silence left behind. I folded the letter carefully, setting it aside on the table, near the lamp that cast its soft yellow glow across the room. I thought about the grave, the ring, the footprints, the flowers, the small acts that had kept memory alive. I understood then that Daniel had tried to make it right. But at what cost? And what had he truly left behind? I pressed my forehead to my hands, letting the quiet fill me. Outside, the winter air whispered through the trees, carrying the scent of earth and frost, of things buried and waiting. The letter had answered some questions, but it had opened a dozen more. I could feel it, pulsing like the heartbeat of the past, echoing through the walls of the house and the hollow spaces of memory. I stood slowly, holding the envelope gently in my hand, the weight of it grounding me to the moment. I realized that the story Daniel had left behind was far from finished. It had returned through Mara, through the ring, through the footprints and the grave, waiting for me to understand, waiting for me to act. And I knew quietly that I would. The winter sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the floor. I placed the envelope carefully back in the floorboard as if tucking the truth into its proper place. But I knew it would not stay hidden forever. The past had a way of following, of rising like frost from the ground. And I could no longer ignore it. I woke to silence. Not the kind of quiet that fills a room with calm, but the kind that hums beneath your skin, alert and waiting. The yard was covered in fresh snow, crisp and untouched, a white sheet that erased everything familiar. I pressed my palms to the window, tracing the frost on the glass, trying to read what the world outside might reveal. And then I saw them. Footsteps. One trail, singular, leading from the woods to the edge of the porch. They stopped exactly where Mara had first stood, holding the ring in her hands, her eyes calm but insistent. My pulse jumped. Was it her? Or someone else entirely? The prints were larger than mine, heavier somehow, pressing into the snow with intent, not hesitation. I slipped on boots, wrapping my coat tighter around me, and stepped into the cold. The snow crunched beneath my feet, a sharp contrast to the soft, muffled world around me. I followed the trail cautiously, every step carrying the risk of revealing myself to whoever, or whatever, had walked here. The air smelled of pine and earth, mixed with the frost, crisp and biting against my cheeks. The footprints led only so far before disappearing into the woods, swallowed by shadow and the low gray light of early dawn. I stood at the edge of the woods, breath fogging in the cold air. The silence pressed around me, thicker than the snow, holding its secrets tight. I could feel a presence like the world itself was holding its breath, waiting for me to notice, waiting for me to act. The wind rustled through the branches, carrying a faint whisper, the sound of movement that didn't belong to me. Somewhere deep in the woods, the snow shifted as though someone unseen had stepped carefully back into shadow. My hands shook, not from cold, though the frost bit through my gloves, but from the weight of realization. The past had returned, and it was not silent. I remembered the ring, Mara's calm presence, the grave with its unmarked cross, and the letter from Daniel hidden in the floorboards. Each thread tied together into a tapestry of memory, loss, and unanswered questions, weaving a story I had tried to keep buried under routine and silence. I knelt in the snow where the prints ended, letting my fingers brush the icy surface. They were fresh, yet deliberate, careful in their placement. Not a mistake. Not accidental. Someone had been here, tracing the path Daniel once walked, marking the same ground that Mara had followed, leaving me a message without words. And I realized in the marrow of my bones that the footsteps were a call. I thought of Mara. Of her calm eyes, her patience, and the way she had returned my ring as if she had known I needed it, not just to see it but to feel it. I thought of the flowers, wilted and replaced, and the silent insistence that someone had been keeping watch all these years. And I understood that the footsteps were not just a trail. They were proof. Proof that the past had not forgotten me, had not forgotten Daniel, had not forgotten the things we tried to bury in silence. I traced the path back to the porch, every step a reminder of how carefully the snow recorded memory. The house was still asleep, the chimney smoke curling lazily into the pale light. I leaned against the doorframe, feeling the cold seeping into my bones, and let the quiet envelop me. The footprints had gone, swallowed by shadow and distance, but their message lingered in the air, like frost that refuses to melt. I pressed my hands against the window again, staring at the empty yard, wondering who had walked there. Mara? Daniel? Or someone else entirely? The snow lay pristine again, but I could feel the story beneath it, waiting for me to uncover, waiting for me to follow. And I knew that this presence, this silent observer, had reasons I could not yet understand. Reasons tied to the grave, the ring, and the secret Daniel had carried all these years. The cold nipped at my nose and fingers, reminding me that time moved relentlessly forward, even in the midst of memory. I took a deep breath, letting it fill my lungs, letting the air sharpen my senses. Someone had returned. Someone had marked the path. And they had left me a choice: ignore it or follow. I pressed my palm to the door, feeling the worn wood beneath my fingers, the steady heartbeat of the house beneath me. I thought about the barn, about Mara's words, about the letter tucked beneath the floorboards. Every detail, every echo, every footprint had led me here, to snow, silence, and the undeniable presence of something waiting. I could not turn away. I would not. The sun rose slowly, pale and hesitant, casting a silver light across the yard and into the trees. I took one last look at the footprints, now fading under the weak sunlight, and let my resolve settle into my chest. The story was calling me forward, pulling me from the safety of my routines into the quiet revelation of winter's morning. I could feel the past stirring, reaching, asking for acknowledgement. And I understood fully that whatever had walked here had been waiting for me to notice, waiting for me to step into the truth. I turned back toward the house, boots crunching softly in the snow, carrying the weight of anticipation and unease. The wind whispered around me, carrying the faintest scent of pine and earth, and I realized that the footprints, the grave, Mara, and Daniel's absence were all part of something larger. A story unfolding quietly, deliberately, waiting for the final pieces. And I knew in the depths of my chest that I would follow them wherever they led. Because the snow had already marked the path and it would not wait forever. Mara arrived just after the first light of morning, her coat dusted with frost, boots leaving thin impressions on the gravel. I hadn't expected her so soon, yet I felt a quiet relief at the sight of her, as if the air itself had been holding its breath until she appeared. She didn't smile. Not really. Her eyes, calm and steady, carried a weight I couldn't yet name. "I think it's time you knew," she said softly, her voice carrying through the chill. She gestured toward the woods where the unmarked grave waited, a solemn witness among the pines. Her words settled over me, heavy and deliberate. I nodded, unsure whether I wanted to hear the truth or protect myself from it. But deep down I knew there was no hiding anymore. He told me about Daniel. About a man he had once helped. Her brother, she said, years before he disappeared. Her voice wavered slightly, though she tried to keep it calm, steady, like someone threading a needle in the dark. Daniel had known her brother needed help, had promised to keep him safe, and had returned often to the woods in secret. But the guilt had consumed him, she said. It was that same guilt that had driven him away from home, away from me. I pressed my hands together, cold and trembling, listening to her, letting her words settle over me like snow. The story fit pieces I hadn't dared to connect. The grave, the returned ring, the footprints in the snow. Daniel had tried to protect someone else and in doing so had vanished, leaving me with silence and questions that had grown heavy over 7 years. I felt my chest tighten, the weight of realization pressing down. He had carried the burden alone, quietly, without asking me to share it. Mara spoke of the grave again, of the flowers he left, wilted, replaced, proof of his secret pilgrimage. Each detail painted a picture I had never known, a life behind the life we had shared. She paused, letting the words hang between us. "The man buried there, he trusted Daniel to see him safe," Mara said, her voice barely above a whisper. "And Daniel, he tried. But he couldn't fix everything. Some things are too heavy even for love." I wanted to ask questions, too many and yet not the ones that mattered most. I wanted to demand answers about why he left, where he went, why he never returned. But Mara's gaze held me in place, calm and unwavering. I realized then that I was only just beginning to understand. Daniel's disappearance had not been abandonment. It had been a retreat, a silence born of responsibility, fear, and a desperate hope to make things right from afar. I thought of the ring still in its small box, and how heavy it had felt in my hand when Mara returned it. It wasn't just jewelry. It was proof. Proof that Daniel had walked this path silently, leaving breadcrumbs for me without ever knowing if I would follow. And I understood in that quiet moment that his absence had never been empty. It had been full of unseen acts, quiet heroism and love that he couldn't express aloud. The wind rustled through the dry grass around the porch, carrying with it a whisper of pine and cold earth. I could feel the winter pressing against my coat, pressing against my chest, reminding me of the years that had passed while secrets lingered in the dark. I thought of Mara standing patiently and I realized the truth I had been avoiding. Daniel had lived and acted in a shadow, but his choices had consequences I could no longer ignore. And now, those consequences were reaching out, calling me to witness them, to bear them with him even in his absence. I followed Mara silently toward the edge of the woods, the snow crunching softly beneath our boots. The air was crisp, the scent of frost and pine heavy in my lungs. We stopped at the unmarked grave, now familiar in its solemn stillness. I pressed my hand to the earth, feeling the frost bite through my gloves, grounding me, reminding me that this was real. Daniel, the grave, the past I had carried unknowingly. "He came here often," Mara said quietly. "Left flowers. Kept watch. Tried to make it right in ways you would never see." I closed my eyes, letting her words wash over me, imagining him there, kneeling beside the earth, carrying the weight of someone else's life in silence. I thought of the years I had spent waiting, wondering, pretending he had simply disappeared. And now I realized he had never truly left. I felt a quiet anger rise, gentle but insistent. Not at him, but at the years of misunderstanding, at the loneliness, at the secrecy that had built walls around both of us. And then a deep ache of sorrow, for what he had carried, for what I had not known, for the love that had been expressed in ways I couldn't yet fully understand. Mara's hand brushed against mine briefly, grounding me, reminding me that I wasn't alone in carrying the weight of these truths. We lingered at the grave, the winter wind carrying soft whispers through the trees. Somewhere in the distance, a crow called, sharp and abrupt, breaking the stillness. I realized then that the story Daniel had hidden was not just about guilt or fear or absence. It was about trying quietly to do right in a world that doesn't always allow it. And I understood that knowing this truth didn't erase my sorrow, but it changed it. I pressed my palm to the cold soil again, feeling a connection to the man I had loved, lost, and now in a new way understood. Daniel's secret was heavy, but it was also human, flawed, and filled with intention. I could feel the weight of the years, the choices, the silent walks to the grave, and the love woven between actions unspoken. And I knew that this story, the one he had tried to hide, needed to be carried forward, acknowledged and respected. I stood slowly, brushing snow from my coat, taking one last look at the grave. The flowers, wilted yet persistent, whispered of continuity, of memory, of quiet acts of devotion. Mara nodded once, subtly as if confirming the understanding I had just reached. The past, hidden though it had been, had finally made itself known. And I realized that in knowing it, I had begun to carry it with me, not as a burden, but as a testament to what Daniel had tried to do and what I could now honor. The winter light shifted, pale and deliberate, over the snow-covered ground. I traced the steps we had walked, the stories we had uncovered, and understood that some truths can't be buried. They rise quietly, insistently, like frost lifting from the soil. And as I followed Mara back toward the house, I felt the pull of the story, the weight of Daniel's choices, and the undeniable presence of someone who had never truly left. The air was sharp and brittle, the kind of winter cold that makes your lungs ache with every inhale. Mara and I walked side by side toward the unmarked grave, our boots crunching softly in the frost-laced grass. The trees loomed silently above, skeletal arms holding onto the gray morning sky. Somewhere in the distance, a crow called once, its voice cutting through the quiet. I pulled my coat tighter around me, feeling the chill seep through the fabric and into my bones, but I kept walking. The grave came into view, the earth settled but uneven, like it had been touched recently. And it had. Fresh flowers lay across the dull soil, bright against the muted brown, petals trembling in the cold breeze. I knelt slowly, pressing my palm against the earth. The frost bit into my skin, but I didn't pull away. I whispered Daniel's name, soft, deliberate, letting it roll across the silence, hoping it might reach him wherever he had gone. A soft sound came from the woods, barely perceptible. A shift in the snow, the low rustle of movement. I held my breath. Mara's eyes met mine, calm but alert as if she too had felt it. There was no figure, no shadow beyond the trees, yet I could feel the presence, patient and watchful. The grave, the flowers, the snow, all of it answered a question I had not dared to ask out loud. Someone was here, keeping watch, honoring the past in ways I could only begin to comprehend. I knelt longer, letting my fingers trace the frost-matted grass, imagining Daniel kneeling here, leaving flowers in secret. His hands, careful, deliberate, pressing life into memory in a place no one had seen. I thought of the letter in the floorboards, the ring returned by Mara, the footprints in the snow, all pieces of the same story scattered across years and winter nights. And now, standing here, the story pressed against me, vivid and undeniable, I felt both grief and a strange release. Daniel's absence had not been empty. It had been filled with intention, love, and quiet responsibility. Mara finally spoke, her voice soft, reverent, carrying across the frost-laden field. He knew, she said simply. Knew what he couldn't fix and still tried. That's why he returned, why he kept the grave. I exhaled slowly, letting the words settle like snowflakes on my shoulders. It was more than I had expected, more than I had dared hope. The past had a voice, subtle and patient, and for the first time in years it answered. I traced the edge of the flowers with a gloved finger, feeling their fragile weight against the earth. Whoever had left them had done so quietly, without fanfare or acknowledgement. It was an act of devotion, of memory, of someone who understood the value of silence. I felt the same pull I had felt years ago when Daniel vanished, the weight of responsibility, the ache of absence, the unspoken truth pressing into my chest. And now I knew the answer had been here all along. The sound came again from the trees, soft and deliberate, like a shadow shifting in respect for the moment. I didn't look, couldn't. The presence was not meant to be seen, only felt. I felt it like frost creeping across the soil, patient and unmoving. And I understood that the story we had uncovered was not just mine or Daniel's, but part of a larger rhythm of human care, hidden acts, and quiet legacies. I rose slowly, brushing snow from my knees, letting my eyes sweep the muted landscape. The field, the trees, the grave, the flowers, all of it seemed alive with the memory of what had come before. Mara's presence beside me was a steady anchor in the cold, her quiet confidence giving shape to the truths I was only beginning to hold. I pressed my hand to the grave once more, letting the cold, solid earth ground me. It was real, undeniable, and it carried the weight of every step Daniel had taken here, unseen, unacknowledged, but not forgotten. I thought about the ring, the footprints, the letter, all the ways the past had returned to me. They weren't coincidences. They were reminders, deliberate and patient, guiding me toward understanding, toward acknowledgement. The grave had answered, but not in words. It had answered through presence, through touch, through quiet insistence that some stories cannot be buried forever. And I knew then that what Daniel had tried to do, in secrecy and in absence, had not been wasted. I stayed longer than I intended, letting the frost bite at my cheeks, letting the cold wrap around me like a reminder that memory is tangible, persistent, and often heavier than snow. Mara didn't speak again. She didn't need to. We understood each other in the quiet, in the unspoken acknowledgement of the effort, the love, and the courage that had shaped Daniel's choices. The grave, the flowers, the winter field, it all spoke more clearly than words ever could. I finally rose, brushing the last flakes of frost from my coat. The wind whispered through the trees, carrying the faint scent of earth and pine. I glanced back once at the grave, letting my hand linger in the air, imagining Daniel's presence in the stillness. The snow-covered field held its secrets well, but it had allowed itself to answer when I was ready to listen. And in that quiet moment I felt a small, fragile release, a thread of closure woven into the fabric of loss, guilt, and enduring love. As we turned back toward the path home, I realized the grave's answer had not been a revelation exactly. It was a reminder that love can exist quietly, without notice, without acknowledgement, and yet still leave its mark. And that sometimes the truth doesn't shout. It waits in frost-laced grass, in wilted flowers, in the soft, patient presence of someone who refuses to forget. The morning light deepened, pale and steady, revealing footprints in the snow that led away from the grave. I followed Mara silently, letting the echoes of the past settle behind me, carrying with me the knowledge that Daniel's story, the one he hid, the one he lived, had finally spoken. And it was enough. The wind was still, holding its breath over the unmarked grave. I stood beside Mara, the frost crunching softly beneath our boots, and pressed my palm against the cold earth. The flowers, bright and fresh against the dark soil, trembled in the early morning light. I could feel the weight of every step, every secret, every choice pressing into me, urging me to speak, to act, to remember. And finally I let the words begin to fall. "I've hidden so much," I whispered, voice trembling against the silence. The ring, the fear, the guilt, the truth I couldn't face. I felt the chill reach into my chest, but I didn't pull away. Mara's hand brushed mine briefly, grounding me in the moment, reminding me I was not alone in carrying the past. Together we had come to witness, to honor, to lay down the weight Daniel had carried in silence. I lifted the wedding ring and pressed it onto the stone, the metal cold against my fingers. It had been hidden, buried, carried for years like a secret too heavy to speak. And now, placed on the grave, it became something else entirely. A symbol of release, of acknowledgement, of love remembered. The sunlight caught its surface, sending a small glint across the frost-matted grass, fleeting but undeniable. I whispered Daniel's name, letting it roll across the quiet, knowing that he had tried in his own way to make things right. The grave was no longer unmarked. Together Mara and I had carved a name into the stone, finally giving her brother recognition, dignity, a place in memory that had been denied for decades. I felt the weight of years lift slightly, the snow, the frost, the winter air absorbing the echoes of grief and guilt that had clung to me. The wind rustled through the trees, carrying a faint, almost imperceptible whisper, like a sigh of approval from someone who had long since departed. And I understood fully that some truths must be spoken aloud, and some acts must be witnessed to find peace. I stepped back, letting my gaze sweep across the graveyard, the woods, the field, and the house beyond. The footprints, the letter, the ring, the flowers, all had led to this place, to this moment, where past and present collided in quiet acknowledgement. I breathed deeply, letting the cold air fill my lungs, and felt the threads of the story wrap around me like a fragile, invisible cloak. Daniel's choices, Mara's patience, the secrets I had carried, they were all woven into a pattern I could finally see, and in seeing it I felt release. The snow crunched softly beneath our feet as we turned to leave. I glanced back once, and for a brief moment I thought I saw a figure retreat into the trees. Tall, familiar, walking with a rhythm I recognized. Was it memory or something more? I didn't know, and I didn't need to. The presence, whatever it was, remained in the silence behind us, a reminder that the past lingers, even when we lay it to rest. As we walked toward the house, Mara's voice broke the quiet, gentle, steady. He would have wanted you to know, to understand. I nodded, letting the words settle, letting them carry the weight of years, of secrets, of love unspoken. And I realized that understanding, even delayed, was a kind of justice. A quiet, slow, patient justice that needed no court, no witness beyond those willing to see. Back inside, the house smelled of wood and winter, familiar and grounding. I set the envelope, the ring, and the small tools of memory on the table, letting them rest where they could no longer weigh me down. For the first time in 7 years, I felt something I hadn't allowed myself to feel in a long while. The tentative, fragile space of peace. The past had been acknowledged. The story had been told. And I could finally breathe without holding the silence like a stone in my chest. I thought of Daniel, of Mara's brother, of the footprints in the snow, of the quiet dedication it took to return, to remember, to honor. And I understood something I had not before. We choose what to bury, yes, but sometimes the past chooses to rise, to demand recognition, to leave its traces for those brave enough to follow. The grave had answered. The letter had spoken. The footprints had called me into truth. And I had finally listened. I placed my hand over my heart, feeling the warmth of memory, of loss, of love endured and transformed. The house settled around me, familiar and still, but I knew it held more now than before. A record of what had been lost, and what had been preserved in small, deliberate acts. I glanced at Mara, and in her quiet gaze I saw reflection, understanding, and the knowledge that this story, though heavy, had finally reached its conclusion. Or at least its beginning of closure. Outside, the winter sky began to pale with the first hints of afternoon sun, silver light stretching across the snow and trees. I stepped toward the window, letting the brightness fill the room, letting it warm me in ways the fire never could. The grave, the ring, the past, they were behind me, yet somehow present, lingering like a soft, insistent echo. And I understood that peace, like memory, is a choice we make quietly, deliberately, one step at a time. I breathed slowly, deeply, feeling the weight lift, the frost recede, the silence settle. We had done what we could. We had chosen to acknowledge, to honor, to bury only what could safely remain hidden, and to let the rest rise and speak. And in that quiet reckoning, I felt the first real warmth of hope since the winter Daniel disappeared. Because the past, when faced with care and courage, can answer, and it can heal.